We're continuing our series thinking about Elijah, and we've got a few weeks left, and we may be finishing it this month, or there may be one more in July. I haven't quite made my mind up yet. And so over the past few weeks, Eleanor spoke to us a week or two ago about panic, and we saw Elijah panicking, running away, absolutely terrified. And then last week in the all-age service, and if you're following this online, there's no video of this next one, Presence, because we don't record our all-age services, last week you thought about God's presence and how God's presence brings healing in the panic. And it's just an incredible story about how Elijah says, I want to die. He says, I'm the only one left. It's all gone wrong. He feels miserable. And he's just completely consumed by everything that goes wrong. And he arrives, he heads off hundreds of miles away. And along the way, God feeds him. And I just think it's so wonderful. It's just so wonderful. I have children. They don't always do what I want them to do. They don't always do what I think is best for them. And when they do things that I think are bad for them, when I see them going the wrong way, I don't want to reward them. It feels wrong. Does that make sense? That's just human nature, isn't it? But when God sees Elijah running the wrong way, God feeds him, and God gives him a miraculous sleep. And God says, the journey ahead is too much for you. And I just think this is beautiful, because there's this kind of misunderstanding in Christian circles that God only blesses us if we're well-behaved Christians. And what we learn from this passage is that that's not true. Elijah is a very badly behaved Christian in this moment. As he runs away, he's completely consumed, he's completely overwhelmed, and God knows there's nothing he can say to him. And hundreds of miles later, when God says to say something to him, one of the things he says to him is go back. And I always, as someone who doesn't enjoy walking hundreds and hundreds of, about 100's okay over a period of time, but hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, I just think, every time I read it, I think, could you not have told me that like 200 miles ago to go back? But he couldn't hear it. His mind was just overwhelmed. And when God says to him, what are you doing here? He repeats the same phrase again and again and again, like a broken record. God's presence meets with him in his panic and brings healing. But one of the things that's significant is that Elijah pours his heart out. So although you read it and he's saying, oh, no, I'm here. He's like the bloke from Dad's Army. Do you know what I mean? Don't penny, Mr. Mannering. He just has to get it out. That's what's in there. As he's walked those hundreds of miles, those phrases are in his head. That's what it is. And he's got to get it out. And one of the things that we need to learn is that our honesty begins our healing. Until there's honesty, there can't be healing. We need to be honest. We need to get it out. We need to say, this is where I am. And sadly, sometimes churches are places which discourage honesty, where some churches prioritise perfection over reality. We don't want to be one of those church communities. We want to be a place where we say, actually, it's okay to be Elijah-like. It's okay to say, it's just, today I just feel it's all gone wrong. That's how I feel. We've not had the easiest few weeks in the Ross household, and there are moments that I'm just saying, God, where are you in this? It's all gone wrong. What's going on? And until you can begin to share and tell God that, instead of just thinking, it'll be all right, it'll be okay. Till we speak it out, till we get it out, we can't make enough space for God's presence. So we move on today to the end of the passage that we've been looking at for the past few weeks. So I'm going to read I'm going to read 1 Kings 19 verse 15. So at the end of all this, where am I, verse 15? I'll find it. Comes after 14, bit of a hint. And so God at the end of verse 14 says, that's not what God says. God says, what are you doing here, Elijah? He replied, I zealously served the Lord God Almighty, but the people of Israel have broken their covenant with you, turned down your altars and killed every one of your prophets. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. He said it more quickly than that, I imagine. Then the Lord told him, "Go back the same way you came and travel to the wilderness of Damascus. When you get there, anoint Hazael to be king of Aram. Then anoint Jehu, grandson of Nimshi, to be king of Israel. And anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, from the town of Abel Meholah, to replace you as my prophet. Anyone who escapes from Hazael will be killed by Jehu, and those who escape Jehu will be killed by Elisha. Yet I reserve 7,000 others in Israel who've never bowed down to Baal or kissed him." So God speaks to Elijah, having restored and begun healing and at work in his life. And of course, on that journey back, instead of those words of negativity, he's walking back with words of positivity. Now, we all know life's not that simple, and the negative doesn't go and the positive's there, and it's all that easy. But there's a shift beginning to take place. And as he walks back, it's beginning to sink in. And he begins to think about his purpose. So what does God say to him? He says, go back and anoint 3 people. The first one was Hazael, king of Aram. Second was Jehu, king of Israel. And the third was Elisha as prophet. So Hazael and Jehu were not kings, obviously, because he had to anoint them. But there already were kings in those places. So it's a little bit awkward. It's like saying go into your workplace tomorrow and tell someone they're going to be the boss. Do you know what I mean? And don't worry about what the boss thinks, just go and tell them, it'll be fine. And so there is a little bit of awkwardness about this. And it's interesting, as you read through the chapters that come, is that Elijah actually doesn't do 2 of these things. I don't know if that surprises you or not, but there's 2 of them that he just ignores. And he doesn't want to do it. So let's think about those 2 first. So in 2 Kings chapter 8, quite a while later, at least 12 years later, I'll say more about how I know that in a minute, at least 12 years later, but probably more like 20, Elisha, not Elijah, Elisha reluctantly goes to Hazael and says, "You're going to be the next king of Aram." And then effectively he says something to him, but I don't like it very much. So there's no anointing going on. There's no, this is what the Lord has said to you. It's like, oh, go on then. But I really hate you. And that's kind of like probably what it says in the Message translation. But that's certainly the kind of gist. And basically what Elisha says to him is, you're going to cause so much pain to Israel, I can't be excited about this. So it's interesting that God says anoint and tell him that I'm at work in it, which translates 12 to 20 years later to, oh, go on then. Jehu, king of Israel, one of Elisha's servants, 2 Kings chapter 9, verse 1 to 6, you can read about this. One of Elisha's servants, he wasn't even worthy of Elisha, goes to him and says, he does anoint him as king. And then Jehu does the only thing he could do in the ancient Near East, and he goes and bumps off the person who is king so that he can be king. And it's all very, would make a great soap opera. And we're going to sidestep the ethical side of that in a minute, because in a week or 2 our theme is going to be puzzling, and we're going to speak about how some of these stories and some of the ethical nature of what we're reading in the Bible does trouble us, doesn't it? And so we're going to think about that in one of the most bizarre Bible stories I guarantee you've never heard at Sunday school or kids' church, but you can look forward to that in a week or 2. And it involves Elijah. And it's interesting, we'll all have been familiar with what we've covered in Elijah so far, but it'll be interesting to see how many people will have heard what's coming next. It's the bit that gets edited out, it's a bit awkward. So, we got Hazael, king of Aram, Jehu, king of Israel, and Elijah never speaks to either of them as far as we know. And then we got Elisha as prophet. So if you go to the Walk Through the Bible website, and if you'd like the link for it, I can send it to you. Wonderful organisation. And they have a chart that's called Kings of Israel. So you've got King Ahab, who reigned from 874 to 853. Remember, this is BC, so the years are going backwards. If you don't understand why, it doesn't matter. That's just the way it works. And so he reigned for 19 years. So at some point in Ahab's life, Elijah was given these instructions. When Ahab dies, his son Ahaziah succeeds him, and he reigned for 1 year. That went well. And following him, he didn't have a son. So Jehoram, his brother, came to the throne, and he reigned for 11 years till he was bumped off by Jehu. And it would make a great box office blockbuster. There's a chariot race and all things involved in the bumping off, so you can go and read that in your own time and look forward to that. So these things are all happening, and it just struck me that 12 years later, 3 kings later, Jehu eventually becomes king of Israel, when God had said to Elijah, can you go and do that for me? That's interesting, isn't it? And I don't really know what else to say about that. It's just something to think, I don't know what to do with it. I don't know. And when you see what Jehu does, he wasn't a godly king. It's all very puzzling. Was that God's will? Did God know Elijah wouldn't do it? What was going on? I don't know. But when he becomes king, he plays his part in this big jigsaw of events that makes things happen. But the one thing that Elijah does do, he goes to anoint Elisha as prophet, and he does that straight away. And one of the things that's really helpful about this is that one of his main complaints to God is, I'm the only one left. All on my own. I'm all by myself. I don't think he sang it, but if he could have sung a song, that's what it would have been. Better than Bridget Jones, all by myself. And then if it goes to Elisha, everything begins to change. And later as we begin to read, this group of prophets forms, and they form community. So it goes beyond Elijah and Elisha. This isn't the 2 Ronnies or Batman and Robin. This is like the beginning of a community that forms of godly people. So Elisha learns that he shouldn't be alone, and that God has not created us to be alone. When I say we shouldn't be alone, that's not to do with whether we're married or not. That's to do with the fact that God has designed us to interact with other human beings. That's just how we're wired. That's how we're made. It's not to say we don't want a bit of peace and quiet sometimes, but we are made to interact with each other. No person is an island and all that. So what I wanted to do is just spend a few moments thinking about Elijah is recommissioned with a purpose, and there's been all sorts of studies about having that sense of purpose and the well-being it gives us, and having that strong sense of this is what I'm here for. So I'm going to suggest 4 things that occur to me. It's not an exhaustive list. Just coming out of this Bible passage and the things that made me think, as I walked across here this morning on my long walk to work, I thought of another one, but I'm not going to add it deliberately because I just want to keep it simple and allow us space to think for ourselves. So what is our purpose? So the first thing that seemed obvious to me is our purpose is to know God. And then I started to add words like follow or obey or serve. And actually, I then deleted all those and then just put to respond accordingly. And I quite like that, because sometimes there are, I better do it then, because God's telling me to. And sometimes there's God, let me do it, I want to do it now. Come on. Do you know what? Life is just different sometimes, isn't it? So we know God, we get to know God, and we respond accordingly. So all 3 things that Elijah was told to do were about bringing Israel back to God. That was the point of all 3. So all this, someone's going to slaughter someone and they're going to slaughter someone else. We can't wrap our heads around that. Again, I'm sidestepping that for today. But we can't wrap our heads around that. But all of it was the aim of saying to Israel, turn back to God. And incidentally, Pete's going to be speaking next week about partnership and thinking more about Elijah and Elisha and how we really need one another. So first thing is to know God. And of course this matches up with the New Testament where Jesus says the greatest commandment is love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind and strength. Jesus says seek first the kingdom of God. Not seek it in your spare time. Seek first. Put the kingdom of God first. He calls us to make disciples. He wants people to know about God. The second area is to live relationally. We're made in the image of God. God is Trinity, Father, Son and Spirit, but one person. God is relationship. And so it shouldn't surprise us that as people made in his image, we need relationship. We need to interact with other people. For some people, that may involve marriage, but some people are single, but they still need relationship. We all need relationships. We all need other people. We all need to interact with one another. And in the New Testament, there are so many one another's. Love one another, encourage one another, build one another up. Christianity is designed as a community faith. You can be saved and going to heaven by yourself, But you can't be an effective disciple of Jesus Christ by yourself. Because there's a whole load of things he tells you to do you can't do. So it doesn't mean you don't know him or you're going to heaven or any of those sorts of things. God calls us to live relationally. A third thing that struck me in the Bible passage was we're called to care for ourselves. And Elijah definitely didn't take good care of himself. And God begins to fix that and teach him good habits. Elijah's exhausted and God gives him rest. Elijah's frantic and God gives him space. Elijah's starving and God gives him food. And I was thinking about the nature of Sabbath. And Sabbath is something we don't talk about a lot. And in the Bible, it talks about working for 6 days and resting on the seventh. And of course, in our modern culture, most people work 5 days and have 2 days of Sabbath or rest, don't they? And actually, to me, it's not important whether it's 1 day or 2 days or 5 days. That would be good, wouldn't it? But what's important is to say to ourselves, how will I find rest? And to ask that question in a non-legalistic way. So for Tracy, she rests by being in the garden. That's madness as far as I'm concerned. That's really hard work for me. I can't spend my Sabbath in the garden, or probably any other day, but that's another story. But she finds delight and rest. For some people, rest by going for a walk. For other people, it's like, when I drive. Do you know what I mean? It's not about being the same as everyone else. It's about saying, how do I care for myself? How do I find that rest? And particularly in this world that's so frantic and busy and stressful, how do I provide self-care? How do I rest well? How do I care for myself? And finally, to become the people who God created us to be. On the people who created us to be. Now, I've used the word restoration, which is probably the wrong word, because when you restore something, you're putting it back to what it was, aren't you? Whereas this is like reverse restoration, where God is restoring us to who we should have been. Does that make sense? So we live in a world, and the world damages us at times. Life is tough, and God is trying to create us as clay in the potter's hands to who we should have been. So I'll just give you a couple of quick examples from me. So Elijah is sent to do 3 things that were specific to him. And I think one of the things I'd encourage all of us to do is to stop and think, who has God called me to be? And one of the things sometimes we do is we churchify this. And so we look at the musicians and say, well, they're created to be musicians. And we look at the kids' church workers and they're created to be kids' church workers. And we churchify. And that's okay and that's really helpful. But actually it's broader than that. Some people are just born to be encouragers, aren't they? And that's great. And it doesn't matter if they're in church or not. That's just who they are. It's who God made them to be. But it's also something that can be very specific. So I think one of the things that people say about me is I'm very creative. And I remember as a teenager, I had very poor self-worth. Didn't think I was worth anything, couldn't do a thing. And someone was telling me about everyone is creative and everyone can serve the Lord. And I was like, not me. Not me. And there was a real breakthrough moment in my life where I had a conversation. And it wasn't that I'd rationally understood anything. It was just that spiritually something flipped in my mind. And I began to see myself as someone who was creative. So rewind all those years. It was about 2 or 3 years ago when I was a teenager. And rewind all those years and think, if I don't have that conversation, and I spent the last however many years in ministry where God is encouraging me to be creative, but the voice in my head is saying, well, you're not creative, you're rubbish. How's that going to go for me? And the answer is not very well at all, is it? Do you see something? God is restoring me. And if anyone can come up with a better word, I'll be delighted. He's changing me back into who he intended to be. One of the other things that God has called me specifically to do, I'm an explainer. So I can take things that are difficult for people to understand and explain them and try and translate them into ways that are understandable. But again, coming out of that sense of poor self-worth and, well, no one would listen to me. I was very Eeyore as a teenager. No one's going to listen to me. And actually needing to say, how's that going to go if I'm stood here this morning going, well, Elijah did this. And there's nothing wrong with having an Eeyore personality. I'm not trying to belittle anyone, because some of us live our lives like that, and that is actually part of who some of us are. And that's the reason we are all different. But what I'm trying to do is not going to go very well unless I can discover who God has made me to be. So part of what God is doing in me is restoring me to the point where I can more fully become the person he made me to be. And he's not finished yet, because I'm not perfect and I make mistakes, and it's heartbreaking sometimes when you do make mistakes. And you know, hold that sense of God's love, but you hold that sense of God's not finished with me yet, and what am I learning and who am I becoming? So what is our purpose? What I'd just like us to do for a moment is just sit and ponder this. I was going to do a bit of group work, but I'm not sure we've got time. If you would like to, just huddle with a few people around you, or if you would like to sit quiet, just do that. And we're just going to take 3 or 4 minutes, not necessarily to talk about these things, but just to say, what is my purpose? What is our purpose? What does this make you think, this question about purpose? So those are very poorly phrased questions deliberately, because it's a very vague conversation. So just for 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll finish with some more song worship. How do we know what is this thing about purpose? So whether we're quiet or whether we're going to have a little conversation, let's just think about this thing about God's purpose. What's missing from the list? Loads of stuff. So over to you just for a few moments.